All right, today we are going to kind of walk through chapter 6, which you guys read last night. And you might feel when I'm doing this with you today, I would, if I were you guys and I were a high school student, I would probably be going, why did I do this reading last night? Mrs. Turner's just going to go over it really well. And while I understand that feeling, I do want you to know that the reason that you did the reading last night before I'm going over it now is because it is such a complex text that it can be so easy to get lost that the second time going through it is actually going to help it make more sense to you. And you're going to catch a lot on that second read that you didn't on the first. So there are some things I'm not going to be reading this entire text to you. I'm going to be pointing out some information that's important, helping you draw some conclusions from the material that you've read and show you some things that are important. So the first thing that I want to show you is down here in the second paragraph. We obviously know in the first paragraph that Hindley comes home with his wife, and nobody is really that impressed with her. But the thing I want us to look at is this phrase right here, though I should have been dressing the children. Now, one of the significant elements of this is that Nellie is distinguishing herself from the children of Wuthering Heights in that she is an adult and they are children. And I want to take this opportunity to give you a little bit of information about the ages of everybody. It's not super essential that you have an exact age in your head for every character at every stage of this book, but it is helpful to remember the differences between their ages, and it's helpful to know how old you should be thinking of them at this time. So we know from the previous reading that when Mr. Earnshaw left to go to Liverpool, when on the visit where he goes and finds Heathcliff and brings him home, before he leaves, we are told that Heathcliff is 14 years old on page 37. Or sorry, not Heathcliff. I am so sorry. Let me mess you guys up a little bit more. I'll just write it in there. Hindley is 14 years old when Heathcliff comes home. Cathy is 6. So there is roughly an 8-year gap between the two. Heathcliff, you can always think of of him. Can you guys tell I have a fever? You could always think of Heathcliff as being roughly the same age as Cathy. He might be a few years older than her. He might be exactly her age. We don't know. He doesn't know his birthday. He doesn't know how old he is, and so he can't ever tell anybody. All we get is Nellie's first impression where she says that he looked about the same age as Cathy. So we also know that Mrs. Earnshaw dies roughly 2 years after Heathcliff arrived in the house. We're told that you probably missed it. It's extremely easy to miss it and overlook it. Look at on page 38. In the middle of the page, when Nellie says, so from the very beginning, he bred bad feeling in the house, and at Mrs. Earnshaw's death, which happened in less than 2 years after, the young master had learned to regard his father as an oppressor rather than a friend. So by the time Mrs. Earnshaw dies, Hindley is going to be 16, and Cathy is going to be 8. All right, so then we have kind of a forward progression there. Then we have Hindley being sent away to school, which is what you read about in chapter 5 last night. And we are told in chapter 6 that he has been away for 3 years. By the time his father dies and Hindley returns, he's been gone for 3 years. So imagine him 19, 20-ish. We're not exactly sure because there's no timeline of how much time passes between Mrs. Earnshaw's death and the day when Mr. Earnshaw sends Hindley off to school. We don't know. Could be a month, could be a couple of weeks, could be a couple of months, could be a year. We're not sure. So we're kind of making rough guesses about the exact age. But he's in his early 20s. So think of him just a little bit older than yourselves. And remember that in this time period and in this place, he would be considered an adult. He was obviously old enough to get married. He came back with a wife, and he comes back to be the master of the house. At his father's death, he inherits that home, he inherits the land, he inherits any of the family money. He is the legal adult authority. Even though Joseph is far older than him, Joseph is just a servant, and Hindley is now the master, regardless of his age. If you're having trouble thinking of somebody this young being that authority figure, what I want you to remember is that in our own culture, somebody who is 18 can make lifelong decisions. When you're 18, you can legally decide to get married if you want to. I'm not going to recommend it, but you can do it. You could also decide to join the military, and that's a decision that will change the course of your life. And you are allowed to make that decision at the age of 18. You can open up a credit card, another decision that'll change the course of your life. And it's society saying you are an adult. You are capable of making these decisions that are going to have lasting impact on your life. You're allowed to do it. So this is where Hindley is. And Hindley, we know, is the same age as Nellie. He and Nellie are compatriots. They grew up together. They were of a similar age. So whereas Nellie, the I in this sentence, she is in her early 20s as well, she's talking about the children. And the children that she's referring to are, of course, Heathcliff and Cathy. And at this point, if we add 3 years to their ages, they're 11-ish, okay? I hope I've done my math right. The fever is raging in my brain, you guys. I'm like Claudius. Somebody get Hamlet. He's at the fever in my blood. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. I had to make that reference. I'm an English teacher. These things happen. Okay, so we have this, and I want you to see the reason that this is significant, not just to give you the ages and the outline with that, but the other reason that this is significant is because it shows us that Nellie does not see herself as being compatriots of Heathcliff and Cathy. She does not see herself as being their equals. She sees herself as someone who is an adult when they are still children. And that is going to help us understand kind of her behaviors throughout the rest of this novel. Okay, so the rest of this paragraph, we have description of our lovely new Mrs. Earnshaw being Hindley's wife. And you're going to get this description that probably doesn't mean very much to you. Nellie says, oh, she was young, she was pretty, and she was really afraid of death for some reason. Very strange. And she says, I did remark that mounting the stairs made her breathe very quickly, and the least sudden noise set her all in a quiver, and she coughed troublesomely sometimes. But I knew nothing of what these symptoms portended. I was too young and inexperienced to know what those symptoms were signs of. And what Nellie doesn't know, but what I will tell you, is that these are the symptoms of tuberculosis. And tuberculosis, sometimes called TB, and in Bronte's time period called consumption, is a disease of the lungs. It's an infection of the lungs. And what happens is that through the course of this infection in your lungs are basically destroyed. And when you cough, you will eventually end up coughing up blood, the bloody remains of your lungs. It will kill you if it's left untreated. Tuberculosis still exists in the world today. We have antibiotics for it. It is very lengthy. It's like a year-long course of antibiotics you have to take to get rid of it. And it is most common in very crowded locations, like lots of people living in small spaces. You're way more likely to get tuberculosis there. In the United States, it is most often found in inmates in federal prisons because they are so tightly packed into those facilities. So you probably are in very little danger of contracting tuberculosis, but it was very common for the readers of this book in 1848. It is the disease that everybody thinks killed Emily Bronte herself. It is the disease that her brother Branwell died of. Everybody in the time period would have known somebody who had been ill or died of consumption. So when they read this description of this young woman who's having trouble breathing going up the stairs, who's coughing troublesomely, and even that detail about her eyes being bright. Consumption victims were often described as having, really bright, almost feverish eyes. Everybody reading this would have said, oh my gosh, those are the symptoms of tuberculosis. Just like if we were writing this book now, we might say, oh, well, she complained all the time that she couldn't taste anything. And we would go, oh my God, it's corona. The people in this time period of the book and its publication would would have gone, oh, those are the classic symptoms of consumption. This lady has consumption. She is going to die pretty soon. Consumption was just not something that most people recovered from. So her death would have been imminent for all of the readers. Okay, so if you were looking for the Mrs. Turner, where did you get your 3 years? There's our 3 years. We know he's been gone for 3 years. We don't really care too much what's going on. But the thing that is important to us about him, and, we're not really concerned about his physical changes. What we are concerned about is what he tells Joseph and Nellie. We must, thenceforth, from that point forward, quarter ourselves in the back kitchen and leave the house for him. Hindley's been gone for 3 years, and I'm not interested in his physical changes, but I am interested in the changes of his attitude. In those 3 years, something that he's learned is that there is a distinction between the back kitchen and the house. The house is for the masters. The back kitchen is for the servants. Before Hindley was ever away from Wuthering Heights, the only way that he knew to operate was the way that that household operated. And we have seen before that division between master and servant is a division that is weak in Wuthering Heights. It's like got, bars through it or whatever. I was trying to be creative there, but it's not working. We'll do it like this. But when Hindley's had a chance to be away and he's seen how the rest of the world operates, he realizes that, in other houses, the servants don't sit down and eat with the masters. In other houses, the servants stay in the kitchen. And he comes home and he reestablishes that boundary. He says, I know how it's done in the real world. I know how it's done everywhere else. That boundary, this boundary right here, we're going to build that as thick and as strong as a brick wall. The servants are going to be in the servants' quarters doing the servants' things, making the servants' actions. The masters are going to live in the masters' quarters and do the masters' things, and the masters are going to make the decisions about how things happen in this house. So whereas his father, at the time of his death, was happy to let Joseph kind of run the show, when Hindley comes in, he reasserts the authority of his class. And he says, no, I'm in charge here, and I'm going to be in charge here. You have to eat in the kitchen. We see him reassert that dominance with Heathcliff by the end of the chapter, when he forbids Heathcliff from eating with the family anymore, from learning from the curate, from playing with Catherine. We see him even further, add another brick to that boundary between the servant class and the master class. So we see that in there. Mrs. Earnshaw, lovely Frances, is excited to be sisters with Catherine. I'm sure that's going to work out really well. But what we care about is this line. A few words from Frances, evincing a dislike to Heathcliff, were enough to rouse in him all his old hatred of the boy. So we get this image that he comes home, his father is dead, that's obviously an upsetting thing, but he's got a new wife, and he's in charge of everything. So maybe he's not so focused on his I hate Heathcliff. But Frances says one word against Heathcliff, and Hindley's like, oh yeah, I hate that kid. And now I'm in charge, so I'm going to make him as miserable as I possibly can. And this is where we get the information that, in fact, he drives him from their company to the servants, deprived him of the instructions of the curate, and insisted he should labor out of doors, clearly turning Heathcliff into more of a servant than a member of the family. So this position that he felt Heathcliff had taken from him, the position of the favored son, he now takes from Heathcliff. The roles are reversed, and he gets his vengeance by knocking Heathcliff back down a peg, by putting Heathcliff, as Kathy writes in the diary, back in his right role. Now, Nellie tells us that at first, Heathcliff handled this pretty well. Kathy kept him up in his schoolwork, but because the young master here, that is Hindley, because Hindley is totally negligent of them, does not care for his sister and Heathcliff like a parent should, and he's young, but he's still taking the adult role. He should be making sure that they are educated. But he doesn't do that. So they're running around, they're wild, they're out doing whatever they want. And we are told again, just as we were told yesterday, that even after they are punished, whether Heathcliff is flogged or Catherine is, made to not have dinner or supper, the after punishment was a mere thing to laugh at. They forgot everything the minute they were together again, or at least the minute they had contrived some naughty plan of revenge. It doesn't matter what you did to punish them. As long as they could be together, they would get over that punishment. They know that those punishments are temporary. Whether you're beaten, whether you're kept from a meal, whatever the little punishment that you face is, it doesn't matter as long as you are together with the person that you are connected with in the end. And that's how they see each other. We talked about it, about this connection between the two of them, and about how it's kind of like, it's Heathcliff and Cathy versus the world. Whether that world is Hindley or Nellie or the curate or the church, whatever it is, it's the two of them against the world. And we see evidence of that attitude here in these passages. Now we get to what really gets interesting. So Nellie tells us that it's a Sunday evening. The two of them have been banished from the sitting room for making some kind of noise or another. And she went into the kitchen to find them, but they were gone. This right here, I could discover them nowhere. This passage here, we are reading about the same night of Catherine's diary entry. So that diary entry that Lockwood read about the day where they had to sit in the attic and listen to Joseph's sermon, now we're going to find out what happened while they were out on the moors. If you'll remember back in chapter 3, Lockwood reads up to the point where Cathy and Heathcliff had decided to go out to the moors. And then the diary breaks off, and he says the very next entry is Cathy crying about what has happened and how Hindley is treating Heathcliff differently. Well, now we're going to find out what exactly happened in between those two entries. What is it that occurred? And this is why Nellie is such a great point of view character, because we're getting into this information that only she knows. Cathy didn't write about it in her diary. Lockwood is certainly not going to ask Heathcliff about it. Hindley's dead. Everybody else is dead. How are we going to find this information? Because Nellie was there. Nellie was the witness. She is the person that sees these things, hears about these things, is told about those things. And she tells us, practically the whole night passed, and then Heathcliff shows up by himself at the end of the night. And, Nellie's like, what happened? Blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, let me tell you. And I'm not going to give you every detail, but I do want us to analyze pretty closely what happens. So they go to Thrushcross Grange. It's the first entry of the Grange in the text. And that's up here in this line here. He says, where we went to Thrushcross Grange. We were out there in the wet, in the wild. Remember the storm of that night. And we thought, you know what? Let's go take a look at Thrushcross Grange and see how they spend their Sunday evening. What are the Lintons like? What do they do with their spare time? Do they look like our family? And Heathcliff says, no, they don't. And then, this is where I want you to look at the language. Heathcliff says that he and Cathy crept through a broken hedge, that they groped their way up a path and planted themselves under the drawing room window. So I want you to look at these words. Words like crept and groped. They are not walking with confidence up to this place. They're not ringing the doorbell. They're not knocking on the door. They are sneaking. And if somebody is sneaking, that tells you they don't belong. Okay? If you're sneaking through somebody's property, you shouldn't be on that property. And they creep through a break in the hedge, and that word broken is going to be important for us to remember. So then we are also told that they plant themselves under the drawing room window. Windows are not doors. I know you're like, no duh, Mrs. Turner, we know that. And the distinction that I want to draw here is that they serve different purposes. A doorway is a pathway through which you might enter or exit. A window is not meant to serve that purpose. A window is a space that you can look through, but it is not a space through which you can move. So if somebody is looking into a place, into a house, through a window, that tells you that they are looking into a space where they are not permitted to enter. It helps us see them as outsiders. Okay? And they can only look in by standing on the basement and clinging to the ledge. Heathcliff and Cathy are literally up on their tiptoes, their fingers over the window ledge, their eyes peering over the edge. It's not comfortable for them. The view is not easy. It is as if they are not meant to see what they see inside. And they're not meant to see it because they're not meant to have it. It doesn't belong to them. When you look at this description, Heathcliff says it was beautiful. It was splendid, carpeted with crimson, crimson-covered chairs, a pure white ceiling, bordered by gold, a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains, shimmering with little soft tapers. This description that he gives might as well be a description of heaven. The streets of gold and the, pearly gates, all these kind of typical descriptions of heaven. And here are he and Cathy shown to us as outsiders. They are outsiders, not just to Thrushcross Grange, but they are outsiders to paradise. They are outsiders to heaven. They do not belong here. Thrushcross Grange is presented to us as a place that is like heaven, and it is a place to which Heathcliff and Cathy cannot gain access, or at least Heathcliff can't, as we see by the end of the chapter. Things that you might have missed. The Linton siblings. The son is called Edgar. This is who ends up married to Cathy on our family tree. The daughter is called Isabella. So the family tree that we made together on Wednesday, male Linton in the second generation, that's Edgar. Female Linton in the second generation, that's Isabella. And then here we're told, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Cathy. So I guess Cathy and Heathcliff must be closer to 12. And what are these two children in these heavenly circumstances doing? They're fighting over who gets to play with the dog. And Heathcliff says, those idiots, that was what they did. They had all this pleasure around them, all this comfort, all of these things, and they were fighting over a dog. He says, how we did despise them. We laughed outright. And what I want you to see here is that Heathcliff has an opinion about these two. He's like, what a bunch of idiots. They're so dumb. If we had the luxuries they did, we wouldn't act like that. And Heathcliff's attitude is going to shape ours. Our first impressions of Edgar and Isabella Linton are being built through his first impressions of Edgar and Isabella Linton. We know nothing about them except what Heathcliff tells us in this passage. Our first impressions are often the strongest ones, and I want you to be aware that your first impressions of Edgar and Isabella are being built through Heathcliff's eyes. But then he says something that I think is even more important. When would you catch me wishing to have what Catherine wanted? And this line means you would never catch me wishing to have something Catherine wanted, because if she wanted it, she would have it. Catherine cannot exist in a state of want when I am there, because I will ensure that what she wants, she gets. If I had something that she wanted, it would be hers. Now that may sound very beautiful and very romantic to you, but it may also sound like the perfect opportunity to end up with a very spoiled person. Whatever you want, you can have. That might be nice for a day, but you treat somebody like that long enough and it's not going to end well. But this is where, Heathcliff's head is at. He then says, I'd not exchange for 1,000 lives, my condition here, for Edgar Linton's. I would never be him. He might be wealthy, he might have this lovely home, he might have all this comfort, but I'd never want to be him. Even if I lived 1,000 lifetimes, I wouldn't want to be him. And then he says my favorite lines, Not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Henley's blood. Now, let me remind you, Emily Bronte has never seen a horror movie. She has read Gothic novels and Gothic fiction where horrible things happen, but here she is, in her 20s, living this life of, very isolated, secluded life, and this is what she imagines. Heathcliff's dream, his dream, where he is trying to tell us how much he would not trade to be Edgar. He says, even if you gave me the privilege of flinging Joseph off the roof and painting the house with Henley's blood, I wouldn't trade. His dearest wish, the thing that he values over everything else, is violence. He's got some pretty violent wishes there, folks. He's like, even if you gave me the opportunity to do this thing I would dearly love to do, throw Joseph off the roof and paint the house with Henley's blood, just, regular Friday night activities, I still would pass up the opportunity to do that rather than be Edgar Linton. I would not be him for the world. And, then he goes on and he says we tried to escape, but they can't escape because the Lintons let the bulldog loose for dog attack number 3. We need one of those, right? And it's Kathy that is bitten by the dog. Heathcliff tries to rescue her. He talks about how brave she is. She didn't make any noise because she was scared. She was just hurt. And the servant from the Lintons' household comes out, and they drag them inside, and he accuses them of being thieves. And he's talking specifically here to Heathcliff, who is cursing and, cursing up a blue streak. It's just like if Charlotte were here cussing us out on her video games. He says to Heathcliff, hold your tongue, you foul-mouthed thief. You shall go to the gallows for this. You'll be hanged. Okay? He is talking to a 12-year-old boy. You will be hanged for this. So we are dealing with people who think that it is acceptable not only to say this to a young person, but to think it about a young person and to have every intention of doing this. And he says, hey, Mr. Linton, don't put your gun down. You might need it still. This is a 12-year-old boy. And they are treating him like he is a dangerous criminal. And Linton goes on in this whole oh yeah, they knew I just collected rents. I've got a bunch of money. They were breaking in to steal my money. How dare they? Blah, blah, blah. And then they pull... They call Heathcliff. They say, don't be afraid, it is but a boy. Yet the villain scowls so plainly in his face. Would it not be a kindness to the country to hang him at once, before he shows his nature in acts as well as features? Just look at him. He looks so criminal. We should do the nation a favor and hang him now before he has an opportunity to act how he looks. That is a horrible thing to think about anybody. It's a horrible thing to say out loud. But nobody is concerned with the things that they are saying about Heathcliff in his presence. And Heathcliff, when he comes home, tells it all to Nellie like it's no big deal. Heathcliff has heard 1,000 times worse and more, as every day of his life. So he is this person who's been exposed to so much abuse that it's almost like it's quit affecting him. Or at least we're meant to think that. He's pulled under the chandelier into the light, and Mrs. Linton raises her hands in horror at the sight of him. The children creep nearer to look at him, like he is some kind of something you would put on display. Isabella says he's exactly like the son of the fortune teller that stole my tame peasant. He's exactly like that gypsy boy. He is exactly like a thief. And so they are immediately associating Heathcliff as an outsider, as a thief, as an object of disgust, and as someone who is dangerous. And that is, of course, the point where Edgar's like, oh my God, we know these people. They live over at the Earnshaw place. We see them in church, blah, blah. They finally realize it's him. And Mr. Linton does the lovely, like, blaming of Hindley. Oh, he's not raising his children. He should be, somebody's got to go talk to him. And they're all kindness to Kathy. They're like, oh my God, she's the master's daughter. You know, she's Hindley's sister. We've got to treat her right. But this phrase here, but who is this? Where did she pick up this companion? Oh yeah, he's that strange acquisition that my late neighbor made on his journey to Liverpool, a little Lascar, or an American or Spanish castaway. So the term Lascar or Lascar is the term that people of his time period, of Linton's time period, would have used to mean natives of the country of India. So whereas you or I might say, oh, that person is of Indian descent, Lascar was the term that they used. Or he's an American castaway or a Spanish castaway. A castaway is somebody that nobody wants. And what I want to draw your attention to with these phrases, Heathcliff, if you look at the way the words that Linton is choosing to describe him, Heathcliff is not white. We don't know, what his parentage is. We never find out. He doesn't know. It's a mystery to him. But whatever it is, he's not white. Or they wouldn't describe him as looking like somebody from India, or looking like somebody from the Americas, or looking like somebody from Spain. Areas of the world that have much more contact with people from different races and ethnicities than the people in Northern England. If you're from America or from Spain or from Eastern Europe, your skin color is more likely to be darker. So we've been told over and over about how Heathcliff is dark and he looks like a gypsy. We get these phrases, you can trace him back from his introduction. And I really want to draw your attention to this, is that this is not just a novel about romantic love, what everybody thinks that it is. It is also a novel about race and about ethnicity and about being an outsider. It's also a novel about class. And there are some pretty significant issues going on here. They get lost because people are swept up in the love story and the great passionate and intense emotions and the insane actions of the people in this book. But when you trace those actions back to their roots, we end up with a story written in 1848 by somebody who decided that they wanted to write a story about what happens when you treat someone like an outsider. And that one of the ways that our author chose to do this, one of the ways she chose to tell this story, was by pointing out that people who look different are treated different. And that is one of the ways that we see this in Heathcliff. And you'll miss all this if you don't know that terminology. You'll miss all this if you're not, focused on the language. But I want you to see that. I want you to hear that. Okay, so they kick Heathcliff out. We can't have somebody like him in the house. But they let Kathy stay. She is, of course, injured. And they're like, oh, dang it, our dog bit this girl. Now we're going to get in trouble. What if they decide to sue us? But they kick Heathcliff out of the house. He sticks around. He watches through the window again. He tells us down here that he was going to shatter the great glass panes to a million fragments unless they let her out if she wanted to leave, if she had wished to return. He's like, I stuck around long enough to make sure she really wanted to stay there. I would have broken her out if she wanted to go. But she didn't. She was a young lady. They made a distinction between her treatment and mine. Sorry, Brian's upstairs scaring the girls. He also scared me. I just jumped a foot. So they treat her very nicely. They wash her wounds. They bring her, tea and cookies. And basically, Heathcliff tells us that he left her as merry as she could be, dividing the food between the little dog and Skulker. And what I want to draw your attention to is this question. Is she thinking of him? Here he is, been kicked out, been called every name in the book, treated like dirt, and he's on the outside of the house making sure that she's comfortable before he leaves. But she gives no indication that she's thinking of him. She's enjoying her treats and playing with the dog and going on about her business. And yet Heathcliff closes with, she is so immeasurably superior to them, to everybody on earth. Is she not, Nellie? He sees no flaws in her. She is perfect, and she is superior to everybody on earth. I might not be so forgiving as Heathcliff is, but he certainly is. And then Nellie scolds him and says, oh, well, more is going to come of this than you think. You're going to get in more trouble. And she says, my words came truer than I desired. So the luckless adventure made Earnshaw furious. And then Mr. Linton came over and scolds him about how he should be more of a parent figure. And we're told that Heathcliff received no flogging, but he was told that the first word he spoke to Miss Catherine should ensure a dismissal. What that means is that if you talk to her, you will be sent away. You will be dismissed from this household. You will lose your job. We will no longer have you here as an employer, and you will no longer live here. And if you go back, what you'll remember is that separation was the greatest punishment. And this is the greatest threat to Heathcliff. Like we talked about in yesterday's video, the greatest way to threaten the two of them is to threaten to separate them. And that is what we have threatened here. So I hope that this helped you understand some of the finer points and the more complicated points, the deeper significance of the events that you read about in chapter 6. This weekend, you need to complete the next reading assignment, which is listed on Schoology, as well as submitting your Hamlet papers by Saturday night. I hope to be back in school with you next week, and if I don't see you on Monday, then I will hopefully see you on Tuesday. Have a lovely